Virtue ethics is the name we give to a way of understanding morality that focuses on persons and what it takes to live a good life, rather than on principles for distinguishing right acts from wrong acts. Virtue ethicists care about doing the right thing, but that is because they care about living well, and acting rightly is necessary for living well. Acting wrongly debases the well-being of the individual or the community. For most of philosophical history, systematic ethics was virtue ethics. The focus on the act as the most important object of evaluation did not become prominent until the modern period, as we will see in a couple of weeks. During the first millennium before the Christian era, most of the major religious and philosophical foundations of civilization in both the East and the West had their birth. Virtue ethics began in ancient China and independently in ancient Greece during this period. It is interesting that Confucius, who was perhaps the first virtue ethicist in history, died just about the time Socrates was born in Greece in 479 BC. The most important virtue ethicist in Western philosophy, Aristotle, lived at the same time as Mencius, who was an important Confucian virtue theorist. As far as we know, neither one knew of the existence of the other. A virtue is a trait we need to live well. In Greek, the word for virtue is arete, which means excellence. Excellence and virtue are the same thing. There are many different excellences. Physical excellences like strength and beauty, excellences of the intellect like intelligence and good memory, and excellences of character. The traits that are most closely connected to living well are the excellences of character, or arete ethicai, and that gives us our English word ethics. Ethics is the study of character, and character for the Greeks is, in an important sense, up to us. It is not something we're born with, nor is it a gift from the gods. We give ourselves our character, and the character we should want to have is the one that will make us live well, to live in a way that fulfills our nature. That is eudaimonia, often translated happiness. Happiness is living well, and living well is fulfilling our human nature. Eudaimonia is our natural end, our natural purpose in living. By now, I imagine you have some questions. Why should we think that excellences of character are up to us? Can we blame people for a bad character and praise them for a good character? Why should we think that the character virtues give us well-being? And even if they do give us well-being, why should we think that the kind of well-being that fulfills our nature is the same as the happiness that everyone desires? And why should we think that human nature exists anyway? The questions increase once we look at the individual virtues. In Plato's Republic, written in the 4th century BC, Socrates lays out 4 cardinal virtues that were adopted as the primary virtues for almost 2,000 years. In fact, all of these virtues would probably be recognized as virtues in almost any part of the world today because they are so central to personal and communal flourishing. These virtues are wisdom, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So far, so good. But we do not all agree on what a virtuous person does. An act that one person calls just, another may call unfair or vengeful or cruel. So we don't all agree on what justice is. This point is even more obvious in the case of wisdom, which can be hard to recognize because the wise person does not always exhibit her wisdom. Fortitude and temperance might be easier to grasp, but there are many questions about the way we apply them. Can we agree on what is courageous and what is cowardly? How do we know when an act is not courageous but is actually foolhardy? The virtue of temperance or self-control raises even more problems of disagreement between cultures and between individuals. How much restraint of food, drink, and sex is the right amount of restraint? What are we trying to accomplish by controlling our urges? These are some of the questions we will ask in this course. When we get to Aristotle, we find that although he accepted Plato's 4 cardinal virtues, he added many more: truthfulness, liberality, magnanimity, friendliness, wittiness, good temper, right ambition, and others. You might be surprised that Aristotle thought of wittiness as a character virtue, as well as 2 different virtues dealing with the proper handling of money: a virtue for handling small sums and a virtue for handling large sums for magnificent civic projects. You may also be surprised that he thought that an admirable person should have high self-regard as well as the regard of others. He would not have recognized a virtue like humility, and he would never have thought that there is a virtue like respect for all human beings. As we will see, the Stoics were better in that respect from a modern point of view. Still, Aristotle's virtues are remarkably resilient and have withstood the test of time and radical cultural change. During the Middle Ages, Christian ethics was shaped by a combination of virtue ethics and biblical teaching. Plato's 4 cardinal virtues were adopted by Aquinas in a Christian form, as well as most of Aristotle's virtues. The difference was that Aquinas thought that since our end is supernatural, enjoyment of the vision of God in heaven, no natural virtue will be enough to fulfill the nature with which we were created. So Aquinas added 3 theological virtues to the traditional list inherited from Aristotle and Plato: faith, hope, and charity. These virtues are infused by divine grace, and their infusion changes the way the other virtues are expressed, usually in the direction of increasing their strength: greater friendliness towards more people, greater self-control, more courage, greater wisdom, and so on. Christian theology taught that there is a divine order of governance in the world, a view that the Stoics held, but with a different view on the nature of God. The virtues allow every person the proper exercise of their role in that order. But what happens when there is no longer a shared conception of the natural order and the good life for a human being? When the virtues are attached to a view of human well-being, and human well-being is attached to a view of human nature, and what we think of human nature is attached to our general view of all of nature, everything we think about virtue seems to depend upon our understanding of nature. Ethics seems to depend upon physics, and Christian ethics depends upon theology. In the early modern period, both of these foundations were assaulted. The scientific revolution changed the prevailing view of nature. The Reformation divided Christendom in a way that led to disagreements about the relationship between nature and grace, and that led to disagreement between Protestants and Catholics on the nature of the virtues. I do not want to exaggerate the collapse of virtue ethics in the modern era, because there were still plenty of philosophers, religious leaders, and biographers and fiction writers who talked about virtues. But in philosophical ethics, the center of gravity made a radical shift in the 17th and 18th centuries. When people who do not agree on their conception of a good life have to get along with each other, the focus of attention becomes acts. Certain acts are intolerable and other acts are demanded. In this context, it does not really matter if you exhibit virtue, as long as you meet the minimal conditions for getting along with other people. Eventually, the justification for the distinction between right and wrong acts no longer referred to a disputed notion of the good life, but took one of 2 major forms. The first form derived from Immanuel Kant, the 18th century German philosopher whose moral philosophy was the most important ever written after Aristotle. Briefly, morality derives from the demands of rationality. Any rational being is capable of grasping it, and all rational beings are under its dictates. Rationality dictates that we do not act in certain ways. The second form derived from the 19th century British philosopher John Stuart Mill, whose classic book Utilitarianism bypassed disputed notions of the good life by reducing good to the forms of pleasure, an idea that he thought everyone could accept. The right thing to do is what maximizes pleasure for the greatest number of people. Both of these theories were enormously influential and were the major competing theories through most of the 20th century in the English-speaking world. They still have very many adherents. But by the second half of the 20th century, many people began to feel that something was missing in modern life, and that the prevailing moral theories did not do justice to human aspirations for fulfillment. Act-based theories seem excessively narrow, focusing on what is demanded of us and what we can get away with little attention to what makes a life really worth living. The call for a return to virtue theory first appeared in England in the mid-20th century in some famous papers by Elizabeth Anscombe and Philippa Foot. Later in the mid-80s, Alasdair MacIntyre wrote a book called After Virtue that attracted a lot of attention in the U.S. We will read selections from these works later in the course. My own version of virtue theory is different from the traditional Aristotelian-inspired versions of most of the history of virtue ethics. My theory is based on what we admire in the most admirable persons or exemplars. It does not depend upon a view of human nature or a particular view of the good life, and it is intended to have a number of different versions for different communities. We will have the opportunity to read a bit of my work on this theory. Contemporary work on the virtues and virtue theory has taken a fascinating turn in recent years. There's a lot of work on the empirical science of virtue, and virtue ethics has attracted the attention of education theorists. At OU, we are beginning a large program on virtue research and the cultivation of virtues in students, with many different projects aimed at different elements of the university community. This course can be seen as an introduction to the philosophical part of that program, and I hope that you will find helpful ideas in that program for the cultivation of virtue and the attainment of flourishing in your own lives.